Okay, the background is dry enough now to work over, and I'm going to start with the buff sort of orangey colour on the left hand side. I quite like that little slab of colour coming in, and we're just going to put in the hint of that. It's a mixture of cadmium yellow deep and burnt sienna with a little bit of magenta in it, just bringing that down, keeping a relatively wet edge. And I'm going to add a little darker colour to this. This is added a little bit of burnt sienna to here just to bring this down, so we're getting a kind of a brownish tinge. This is an autumn or winter scene, moorland scene, so there are no really strong greens much in it, and any greens that I want to put in I can add later on. So we're just bringing this down, and I'm now going to look at the greens that I do need. I'm using a lemon yellow initially and putting a little bit of cerulean into it to give me a cool bluish green initially for the distance, and I'm going to modify this with a little bit of the burnt sienna mix. So we've got a muddy natural green there, and so we'll feed in some greens gradually with a broken brush technique. Dry brush in the foreground would look good, but for now I'm just layering one colour onto another and working back into it. As we get nearer to the foreground, I'm adding a little of the cadmium yellow deep into this mix to get me a richer and slightly warmer green. And again, I don't want the road to look too regular, the edge of the road, so I'm going to break that colour up a little bit as well. Back to the other side, and this is not very green, as I say, it's a rough moorland kind of green, not pasture land, and we'll just bring that in and develop the ground on this side a little bit. As we get nearer to the foreground in the mix, I'm adding more cadmium yellow deep to give me a richer and warmer green, so gradually these greens can be modified. They're still wet, so they're still quite workable, and beginning to get the grass verge here blocked in with fairly loose brush strokes. I don't really want this to be too neat and tidy at the moment, so we'll just run that up there. While I've got the green, I'm going to add some ultramarine to it to make a bluey green, and we're going to look back into the middle distance, and I'm going to put in some hedge rows in the middle distance with this cool and fairly pale green, and superimposed on my background. The thing about working in a watercolour technique with acrylics is it's not going to lift the colour I've already applied, so I can work on this quite nicely with layers of colour, and the colour that I've applied won't move. It's not going to be lifted off, whereas with traditional watercolour you run the risk of lifting the colours off. So it's quite nice. So just a little hint of a hedgerow there, and in the distance where these little streaks are, I'm just going to run another little hedgerow down. I've added a little bit of water to this, and that's bringing that down nicely, and so I've got now the look of distant scrubby kind of fields up here. Where the fields run out onto the moorland, they just sort of fade back into the moorland colours. I'm using a little bit of burnt sienna into the green mix to give me a darker shadowy colour. The shadows are coming across from right to left, so all of this will be casting shadows, and I'm going to put the shadow areas in under the hedge, and as soon as I've got that in, I'm going to wet the hedge area so we don't get a hard line. I've started with the background. The subject is the cottages. When I come to put the cottages in and paint them, they will look reasonable because the background already exists. If I'd started the other way round and put the cottages in, the cottages would look a bit odd because they would not sit in a landscape. And that's the same for any painting you do. If you get the background established, whether it's a still life or a portrait, it helps to have the background in early. We'll put the hedges and the stones in the hedgerow in next, but I'm just going to let this area dry while I mix the next colour up. Okay, so that's dry now, and I've mixed a dilute grey, and I'm going to work this into the shaded side of the cottage. This is a mixture of my ultramarine and burnt sienna. We'll just put that in to give me a background colour. Maybe add a tiny touch of the cerulean to that, give it a slight bluish tinge, I think. There we are. Let's take that in. That gives us the shaded side of the cottage, and a similar kind of colour on some of the sides of the chimneys. So we've got the chimneys coming down, and I'll do the same on the shed, on the left hand side of the shed. This is all the shadow area there, so we'll put some of that in just to give it 3 dimensions. It immediately makes something look 3-dimensional if we start to put the tonal values in. That's worked nicely. I want to put in a very pale grey, so I'm diluting the grey from the cottage side. Roof colours are often lighter than you would think, because that's basically where the sun is coming from. And so often a roof is not dark, and tiles and slates are not necessarily dark colours. So we'll just block that in. And I'm now going to put the darks in on the wall and use a palette knife to scrape back, but I'm just going to wait for this area to dry. So the area of the cottage is now dry. It's just taken 2 or 3 minutes. I've mixed up a darker burnt sienna and ultramarine mix for the hedge here, nice and dark, and I'm going to take a knife and scrape back in just to scrape out some of the shapes of some of the stones in this hedge. This is a technique well worth practicing, just scraping out using the knife. Hold it by its blade if you can. The bigger the knife, the better this effect is going to be. And it's just where the little stones are on the hedge, and that's quite nice. That's given us a stony look.